Good morning. It's lovely to be back, and here we are on day 227 of our 365 days of Bible study. Today, on day 227, we are continuing to look at those very earliest Christian prayers, beliefs, and creeds, which we find in the New Testament if we look hard enough. Today, we're going back to the earliest Eucharistic tradition that we have in the New Testament, and we find this in the writings of St. Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, verses 20 to 28. St. Paul writes, "When you come together as a group, I can hardly describe what you do as the Lord's Supper. You grab your own food and eat it, not bothering to share and make sure that no one goes hungry, and not caring that some are getting drunk. You've all got homes in which to eat and drink. The way you carry on despises the church of God and makes the needy feel ashamed of themselves. Surely you're not expecting me to praise you for this. Praise? I don't think so. So let me remind you about the teaching I received from the Lord, the instruction I passed on to you. On the night he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took some bread, and once he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, broken on your behalf. Do this in memory of me.' Then, in the same way, once they had finished eating, he gave them the cup and said, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. I want you to do this every time you drink it, to remember and honor me.' So, as often as you eat this bread and drink from the cup, you will be announcing the Lord's death until he returns. So, if anyone eats the bread or drinks from the Lord's cup who is not worthy of it, they will be guilty of not respecting the Lord's body and blood. So each of you need to take a good look at yourselves before you eat the bread and drink from the cup." At first, you might think that the best place to look for the origins of the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, would be in the Gospels. But they were all written well after 70 AD, when the communion service had settled down into a pattern, and that affected how Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their narratives, with their regular Sunday worship in mind. Paul's first letter to Corinth is dated very early indeed, say around 55 or 56 AD, and it was written from the port city of Ephesus to this rather unruly house church in Corinth. Paul's opinion of their behaviour is quite clear. Their greed and drunkenness point to a time very early in church life when the Eucharist was still a full-blown bring-and-share supper, a gathering where everything took place at once. This was a time before worship and fellowship had crystallized into worship occasions and separate fellowship events. Paul's criticisms of the Corinthian bun-fight Eucharist will have been shared across the whole growing church fellowship and will have given the impetus to those leading worship to emphasize orderliness and consideration in worship. This will have given rise first to separate events when the community came together, sometimes for worship and prayer, sometimes for study, sometimes for teaching newcomers, and sometimes for contemplation. It's fascinating to have this insight into early church life and the sensible way that St. Paul sorted it all out. It was to St. Paul that the early Lutheran and Anglican scholars went for words to use in their Reformed liturgies, and they also used his words to move their thinking away from medieval superstition. The presence of Christ in the Eucharist, in Paul's mind, is a presence that depends first on remembering him with respect, and then truly to understand the metaphors of broken bread and poured out wine, not as magical transformations, but as deeply meaningful symbols that must be taken seriously. Christ's presence is in his body, the church, and there his word is active and alive in the world, even today, 2,000 years later. So, the Eucharist is ancient, and so, surprisingly, is the Creed. We'll look at one early creed tomorrow. I'll see you then.